A 13-year-old boy is standing in a room so thick with cotton dust that grown men choke on it. His hands are raw. He hasn't had a real meal in 2 days. And the machines around him are screaming so loud that he will be partially deaf by the time he turns 20. His name is Andrew Carnegie. And in that exact moment, in that filthy cotton mill, there is not a single person on earth who believes this boy will amount to anything. They were catastrophically wrong. 40 years later, that same boy will sign his name to the largest business transaction in the history of the world. A single check for $480 million at a time when most American families were lucky to earn $400 a year. He will become, quite literally, the richest man who has ever lived. Kings will not have what he has. Emperors will not command what he commands. And then, in the single most shocking twist in American business history, he will give almost every dollar of it away. This is not a bedtime story about luck. Luck did not build this empire. What built it was a starving family's refusal to accept the life they were handed. A mother fierce enough to gamble everything on a boat ticket to a country she had never seen. And a boy who decided somewhere in the smoke and noise of that cotton mill that poverty was not going to be the end of his story. This is the true story of Andrew Carnegie, the poorest boy in Pittsburgh who became the richest man on the planet. And it starts the day his family lost everything. Part 1. The Ordinary Beginning. In 1835, in the small weaving town of Dunfermline, Scotland, a son was born to William and Margaret Carnegie. They named him Andrew after his grandfather, a man locally famous for his sharp wit and his love of debate. The Carnegie household was poor by any measure, but it was not without dignity. William Carnegie was a handloom weaver, a trade passed down through generations, a skill that required patience, precision, and pride. For centuries, men like William had been the backbone of towns like Dunfermline. Their work was slow, it was honest, and for a little while longer, it was enough. Then the machines arrived. The Industrial Revolution did not knock politely on the doors of Dunfermline. It arrived the way a flood arrives, sudden, indifferent, and impossible to negotiate with. Steam-powered looms began producing cloth faster than any group of skilled hands ever could, and faster than anyone had thought possible. One by one, the independent weavers of Scotland were made obsolete, not because they had failed, but because the world around them had changed and refused to wait for them to catch up. Andrew Carnegie was still a small boy when he watched this happen to his own father. He watched a proud, skilled man lose his trade, his income, and slowly his sense of purpose. There were nights with barely enough food on the table. There were days his mother took in extra sewing work just so the family could eat. It is worth pausing here, because this moment, a child watching his father's dignity slip away because the world changed faster than he could, would shape Andrew Carnegie for the rest of his life. He would spend his entire adult existence making absolutely certain that he would never again be at the mercy of forces he could not control. He would learn to become the one who controlled them instead. But if William Carnegie was the quiet, gentle heart of the family, it was Margaret Carnegie who was its iron spine. She was fierce, she was relentlessly practical, and she refused in the most absolute terms to watch her children grow up in poverty and hopelessness. In 1848, with borrowed money and almost nothing else, Margaret made the decision that would alter the entire trajectory of American industrial history. The Carnegie family would leave Scotland forever and sail for the United States. Imagine for a moment what that crossing must have felt like. A 13-year-old boy standing at the rail of a cramped, swaying ship, watching the only home he had ever known shrink into the gray horizon behind him. No promises waited for him on the other side. No job, no home, no guarantee of anything except the chance, just the chance, to build something new. The Carnegies settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a soot-covered industrial town crouched across the river from Pittsburgh. It was not the golden America of postcards and promises. It was smoke and noise and grinding, unglamorous labor. And into that world, at just 13 years old, Andrew Carnegie went to work. His first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, tending spinning machines for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a room thick with lint that clogged the throat and stung the eyes. His wage was $1.20 a week. Historians still debate the exact modern equivalent, but by any measure, it was barely enough to survive on, and it bought him nothing resembling a childhood. Most boys in his position accepted this as simply the shape their life would take. Andrew Carnegie did not. And this is where his story begins to separate itself from the millions of other immigrant children who arrived in America during the same era, carrying the same hopes, facing the same impossible odds. Part 2. The Hunger for More. There is a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. It is the hunger to understand, to grow, to become something more than your circumstances allow. Andrew Carnegie had that hunger in a way that startled the adults around him. In Allegheny, a local merchant and former militia colonel named James Anderson made an unusual decision. He opened his personal library, 400 books, an extraordinary collection for the time, to any working boy in the area, free of charge, every Saturday afternoon. It cost him nothing but the willingness to share what he had. Young Andrew Carnegie was there almost every single week. While other boys spent their one day of rest playing in the streets, Carnegie sat with borrowed books, reading about history, about statesmen, about the mechanics of business and the architecture of ambition. He later said that this simple act of generosity, a wealthy man sharing his books with poor children, did more to shape his character than almost anything else in his early life. Decades later, this single Saturday afternoon library would echo across the entire United States in a way nobody in that small Pennsylvania room could possibly have imagined. At 14, Carnegie left the cotton mill for a job as a telegraph messenger boy in downtown Pittsburgh, earning slightly better wages, but more importantly, gaining access to something priceless: proximity to the beating heart of the city's business world. He memorized every street, every shortcut, every business address in Pittsburgh so he could deliver messages faster than any other boy on the payroll. He taught himself to translate Morse code purely by the sound of the clicking machine, without needing to see it written on paper, a rare skill that impressed even seasoned telegraph operators 3 times his age. People began to notice him, not because of who his family was, not because of money or connections or luck. They noticed him because he simply worked harder, thought faster, and wanted more than anyone else around him. That relentlessness caught the eye of a rising executive named Thomas A. Scott, an official at the Pennsylvania Railroad, at the time one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the entire country. Scott hired 18-year-old Carnegie as his personal secretary and telegraph operator. It would prove to be the single most important professional relationship of Carnegie's early life. Part 3. The Impossible Dream. Working directly under Thomas Scott placed young Carnegie inside the machinery of American industrial power at a formative moment in the nation's history. He watched how capital was raised. He watched how risk was calculated and how fortunes were made and lost on decisions made in a matter of minutes. He was in effect receiving a graduate education in business, except his classroom was a moving railroad car, and his professor was one of the most capable executives in America. It was Scott who gave Carnegie his first real taste of investing, quietly arranging for the young man to purchase shares in a company called Adams Express. Carnegie did not have the money. He borrowed it, terrified of the risk, understanding on some level that this decision could either open a door or bury him in debt he could not repay. When the investment paid its first dividend, Carnegie experienced something that would define the rest of his career: the electrifying realization that money properly placed could work exactly as hard as any human being, and never needed to sleep. From there, Carnegie began investing wherever he saw opportunity: in ironworks, in railroad sleeping cars, in oil fields during the earliest days of the American petroleum boom. By his early 30s, a man who had once earned a single $1.20 a week in a cotton mill was earning tens of thousands of dollars a year, almost entirely from the returns on capital, not from wages. By any reasonable standard of the era, Andrew Carnegie had already succeeded beyond anything his parents could have dreamed for him. He could have stopped there, comfortable, secure, respected. Most men would have. But on a trip through England, Carnegie witnessed something that most American industrialists had either dismissed or simply failed to notice: a revolutionary manufacturing process called the Bessemer process, capable of converting iron into steel faster, cheaper, and at a scale nobody in the United States had yet attempted. At the time, American infrastructure ran overwhelmingly on iron, cheaper to produce, but brittle, unreliable, prone to fatigue and failure under heavy load. Steel was stronger. Steel was the future. But almost nobody in America believed steel could be manufactured cheaply enough or at a scale large enough to matter. Carnegie's own colleagues in the iron business scoffed at him. Investors were skeptical. Respected businessmen quietly suggested he was chasing a fantasy that would ruin him. It is easy, looking back from the present, to see Carnegie's bet on steel as an obvious stroke of genius. It did not feel obvious at the time. It felt, to nearly everyone around him, like an impossible dream chased by a man who had gotten lucky once and had begun to believe his own luck was destiny. Carnegie committed to it anyway, not recklessly, but with the same calculated, relentless conviction that had carried him out of the cotton mill 15 years earlier. Part 4. The Turning Point. In 1875, Carnegie opened his first steel plant just outside Pittsburgh, the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, named, quite deliberately, after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the largest potential customers for steel rails in the entire country. It was not just a factory, it was a calculated statement of intent. The early years tested everything Carnegie had. Steel production demanded enormous amounts of capital, and the industry was brutally unforgiving of miscalculation. A severe economic depression gripped the country through much of the 1870s, crushing businesses across every sector. Competitors dismissed Carnegie's obsession with the Bessemer process as needlessly risky, arguing that iron had served America perfectly well for decades and would continue to do so. There were moments, real, documented moments, when the entire venture teetered on the edge of collapse, when a single bad quarter might have ended the story before it had truly begun. What separated Carnegie from nearly every other industrialist of his generation was not luck. It was philosophy. While his competitors were satisfied banking steady profits from existing equipment, Carnegie reinvested almost everything back into his plants. He replaced machinery that was barely a few years old the moment something more efficient became available. He drove down the cost of production with an intensity that bordered on obsession because he understood, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else in America, that in an industrial economy, the company that produced at the lowest cost would eventually outlast every competitor who did not. He also understood something about people. Carnegie once said he wanted his tombstone to read, "Here lies a man who knew how to enlist in his service better men than himself." He surrounded himself with brilliant, hard-driving partners. Men like Henry Clay Frick, who ran the coal and coke operations that fed Carnegie's furnaces with terrifying efficiency, and Charles Schwab, a talented young manager who would rise to become one of the most important figures in the entire American steel industry. Slowly, and then with startling speed, it worked. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than entire nations. His mills fed the railroads stretching across a continent still being settled. His steel formed the bridges spanning America's great rivers, and eventually the skeletal frames of the skyscrapers that would come to define the American skyline. Andrew Carnegie had not simply built a company. He had built, quite literally, the framework upon which a rapidly expanding nation was being constructed. Part 5. The Human Side. But success at this staggering scale carried a cost, and it is impossible to tell this story honestly without confronting it directly. In 1892, at the Homestead Steel plant near Pittsburgh, a bitter dispute erupted between Carnegie's company and its steelworkers over proposed wage cuts. Carnegie himself was in Scotland at the time, deliberately distanced from the negotiations, having left the matter in the hands of Henry Clay Frick, a man known throughout the industry for his hardline, uncompromising approach to organized labor. Frick locked the workers out of the plant and brought in armed Pinkerton agents to secure the property and break the strike. The confrontation turned violent. Gunfire broke out between the strikers and the Pinkertons on the banks of the Monongahela River. By the time state militia arrived to restore order, several men on both sides of the conflict were dead. The Homestead Strike became one of the most infamous labor conflicts in American history, and it permanently altered how the public viewed Andrew Carnegie. Here was a man who had written openly and sincerely about the dignity of the working class, who had once been a poor laborer himself, standing exactly where his own father had once stood. And yet his company, in his absence, had responded to a labor dispute with armed force and bloodshed. Carnegie never fully escaped this contradiction, and to his credit, he never pretended otherwise. In private letters, he expressed genuine anguish over how the situation had unfolded. But he had also given Frick broad authority to act in his absence, and responsibility, fairly or unfairly, followed him for the rest of his life. It remained, by his own admission, one of the deepest regrets of his career. This is the part of Andrew Carnegie's story that inspirational retellings often quietly leave out. It deserves to be told, not to diminish what he built, but because the truth is more powerful than the myth. Carnegie was not a flawless folk hero sculpted for a storybook. He was a complicated, driven, sometimes ruthless man, shaped as much by genuine idealism as by cold, unforgiving ambition. Real greatness, the kind that actually changes history, is almost never simple. It is almost always this complicated. Part 6. Building the Legacy. By the turn of the century, Carnegie Steel had grown into the largest and most profitable industrial enterprise on the planet. And in 1901, at the age of 66, Andrew Carnegie made a decision that stunned the business world. He sold it. The financier J.P. Morgan purchased Carnegie Steel for approximately $480 million, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms. Morgan merged it with several other steel companies to form United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the world. The boy who had once earned $1.20 a week in a Pennsylvania cotton mill was now, by many accounts, the wealthiest private individual on earth. And rather than retreat into a life of quiet luxury, Carnegie was, in many ways, only just beginning the most important chapter of his life. Years earlier, in 1889, Carnegie had published an essay that would come to be known as The Gospel of Wealth, arguing something almost nobody among his fellow industrialists dared to say publicly, that the wealthy carried a moral obligation to give their fortunes away during their own lifetimes, rather than hoarding them or passing them entirely down to heirs who had not earned them. He believed with total conviction that a man who died rich died disgraced. It was an extraordinary philosophy for a man of his era and his fortune. And for the remainder of his life, Andrew Carnegie set out to prove, beyond any doubt, that he meant every word of it. He gave away an estimated 90% of his total fortune before his death, a scale of philanthropy that had simply never been attempted before in American history and has rarely been matched since. He funded the construction of more than 2,500 public libraries across the United States, Britain, and the wider world, driven by an unshakable belief that access to knowledge was the single most powerful tool available for lifting ordinary people out of poverty. He funded Carnegie Hall in New York City. He funded universities, scientific research institutions, and international efforts toward peace that continue their work to this very day. Think for a moment about the full circle of that story. A boy who was once allowed, out of nothing but kindness, into a rich man's private library on Saturday afternoons, grew up to give that same exact gift to millions of strangers he would never meet, in towns he would never visit, in a country whose entire population he could not possibly have known personally. He simply believed they deserved the same chance he once had. Part 7. The Ending. Andrew Carnegie died in 1919 at his estate in Massachusetts, having given away several $100 million, a fortune vast enough to permanently reshape entire fields of education, science, and public life across the United States and beyond. His story does not fit neatly into a simple tale of uncomplicated heroism, and it should not be told as one. He was a man who understood suffering intimately, from the inside, in his own childhood, and yet a man whose company, at its darkest moment, allowed terrible suffering to happen under his own name. He preached the dignity of labor with total sincerity, and yet the company that bore his name met labor, at its breaking point, with gunfire. He was, in the truest and most honest sense of the phrase, a self-made man, and also a profoundly, imperfectly human one, built from contradiction the same way all real history is. But his story endures, generation after generation, for a reason. It is the story of a barefoot immigrant boy who arrived in America with absolutely nothing, who spent his childhood breathing cotton dust for pennies a week, and who built, through relentless will, hard calculation, and a willingness to risk everything on an idea nobody else believed in, one of the greatest industrial empires the world has ever known. And then, in the end, he gave nearly all of it away. Andrew Carnegie once wrote that surplus wealth is a sacred trust to be administered during one's own lifetime for the good of the community. Few men in history have taken that idea as seriously or acted on it as completely as he did. The boy who once had nothing left behind libraries in thousands of towns across the world, so that other children, poor, unknown, overlooked, exactly as he once was, might have the same chance he was given. The chance to read, to dream, and to build something the world had already told them was impossible. That is the true legacy of Andrew Carnegie. Not simply the steel that built a nation's bridges and skyscrapers, not simply the fortune that once made him the richest man alive, but the stubborn, unshakable belief, proven true by his own life, from a cotton mill in Allegheny to the boardrooms of American industry, that where you start does not have to determine where you finish.